Hey everybody. So for the last few videos and our discussions from last week, we were trying to grapple with the question of what is literary analysis, right? We looked at that Pokemon essay. We did some of our own analysis with that SpongeBob episode. And what I wanted us to get from all of that was a sense of like what it means to analyze literature and what it means to make an argument about a message the text is sending, right? Just so that we can kind of try to wrap our heads around like what the goal of this essay is, right? Like what this type of essay is supposed to do. So in this video, I kind of want to address maybe some of the like underlying assumptions or fundamental kinds of arguments that are kind of under the surface of this, of like why we would do this and why any of it matters. So the question I think we're transferring from like what is literary analysis to now why do we do literary analysis? How do people have jobs doing this? How are there people who make money from writing books and essays about this kind of stuff? Why should we care? Right? Which, as I've said about writing conclusions and stuff, we always need to have a sense of why someone should care about the essay that we're writing, or how maybe it can affect the way that they see the world, or something that connects with their lives. Because like if we don't have a sense of why this matters, then we're not going to be able to convince the reader that it matters, right? And if we don't do that, then it's not going to be an interesting or engaging essay for our reader. So I think we need to talk about why analyzing literature, analyzing art is a worthwhile or important thing to do. This is also, to some extent, me, justifying my career choice or something like that, because this was the main thing I was really focused on when I was in college was the analyzing of art in this way. So we got into this a little bit, I think, with the with the Pokemon essay, and I tried to lay some of my thoughts out in the discussion thread. And make sure you go back and read those. Especially, I had a couple of posts that I put up myself to kind of respond to some of the things I was seeing in the threads. Make sure you go read those if you haven't done so. But something that people picked up on, I think correctly, was that the Pokemon essay kind of tried to imply, like, I think it was a good essay to pick because it has a clear argument about the text, right? The text being the show in this case. It says, arguments, Pokemon sends kind of this negative message about animal rights and things like that. But they also had in there, and a lot of you picked up on this, they kind of tried to claim that, like, watching Pokemon was going to make kids, like, more aggressive towards animals or something, or that, like, if you're watching this show, you might turn into someone who fights dogs or whatever. And a lot of you kind of picked up on how over the top that kind of was in the essay. I agree with you that they overstated the extent to which this happens. I think we've all heard these arguments maybe from parents or things that, like, if you watch violent movies or if you play violent video games, if you play Grand Theft Auto, you're going to become violent. You're going to go kill someone, right? And I think, these arguments are just not true. I don't really think. I know that the Pokemon essay like cites some kind of research or something, but I think if the consensus in research is that there's not like a direct connection between these things, right? I watched Pokemon growing up. I played Grand Theft Auto. I've never done any of those things. So yeah, I think a lot of you were correct to kind of pick that up, right? That it's going too far to say that art like brainwashes people, right? That if art has a bad message, then it's going to create, it's going to spawn a bunch of monsters or something. Like people were saying this about like the Joker movie that came out recently, right? That it was going to create a bunch of mass shooters or something like that. That never happened, of course. Because it's a movie, right? But I think it's also going too far to say, well, it's not real. It doesn't have any effect at all. It's just make-believe. It's all pretend. We all know that. I think that both of these kind of extremes are incorrect. I think that we need to find a kind of more nuanced middle ground. I think we need to find a way of thinking about art as containing messages that do matter, but to not view it as like brainwashing. You know, we have to find like some kind of way that the messages can and do exist, and that I don't think they're completely unimportant, but I also don't think they're important to the level that they're going to dictate people's behaviors. You know, so I think this essay, ideology and ideological state apparatuses, I think this kind of can help us answer this question or help us figure this out. And I think ideology is maybe the key term that we can understand art as being ideological without it being brainwashing. And that's confusing, and let's try to break it down now. Okay, so I do want to get into the Althusser to help us understand this better. So I know this essay might have been very confusing, you know, and maybe you didn't really know what was going on. But I think that maybe going back to it after watching this video, you can get more out of it. And I think there's some really key things that we can pull out of it, even though it's confusing. It's, you know, it's written in French, translated, it's from the 60s. So I totally understand if that was confusing. Don't worry if you found that very confusing. I think you should have. But yes, I'm going to try to break it down for you a little bit now in a way that maybe makes some more sense. So I have kind of a drawing, a little chart that I made that I always do when I teach this, that I'm going to show in a second here. But let me just start by kind of explaining what Althusser is trying to do. So what I had you read, it was just a couple of pages, right? That's from you know, a whole book. So obviously I didn't give you a lot of the context, but I didn't, you know, I didn't want to make you read too much of it. But he's writing a book that is kind of a theoretical inquiry into like what government is and how governments function and how they stay in power. He's talking about like government in like a theoretical sense, right? Not like any one specific government, just like any government. And he's asking the question of like how do governments stay in power? How do they, you know, keep from being overthrown? How do they continue like making sure that there's continuity of the regime that's in power, right? Because if you come to power in a government, one of your primary concerns is going to be how do we stay in power? How do we not get overthrown by someone else who's going to, you know, do either things that are worse or whatever? So if the question is how do governments stay in power, there's kind of two separate answers. Okay, and now I'm going to throw this picture up here, and I think it'll help us. Okay, so the first answer to this, I think you know, if we think about this ourselves, we could easily come to this answer, right? That if you're trying to stay in power, the first thing that you need, like I have on the one side there, are things like the military, the police, jails, courts, a legal system with laws where, and the muscle to back up the laws, right? Um, Althusser refers to this as the repressive state apparatus, all of these things, right? Repressive because it functions first and foremost by violence. You know, there's the kind of threat of violence with the military and the police, right? If you try to overthrow the government, the military will stop you. You know, why? Because they have guns. You know, when they'll fight you. So I think that is obvious, right? That if you're going to stay in power, you need to have these things. You know, just from like very practical aspect to make sure if anyone tries to overthrow you, you have people to defend your position and to, you know, have consequences and things. So he calls that the repressive state apparatus. That part seems obvious. Now, the other part is what Althusser is kind of famous for and why, you know, people still read him 60 years later. It's the ideological state apparatuses. Apparatus, sorry, just one. Well, I guess there is more than one, actually. You could say apparatuses. Um, so this gets into ideology, right? So maybe we need to back up a little bit to understand this better. Like I have on there, for Althusser, the government or the state, right? The government is always the government of the ruling class. That's his theory. He means this in economic terms, right? Basically, that whichever economic class that there's always an economic class that is like the one that's connected the most to the government and that is ruling over the other economic classes, right? Obviously, if you think about our society, it's easy to see. I don't think it's controversial to say that the extremely wealthy are the ruling class, right? That the government works the most in their interest. If you look at, you know, things like the way that we do taxes, or the military-industrial complex, these kinds of things, right? That I think everyone acknowledges. We can see how the super wealthy are in control of the government in a way that like poor people aren't. So this is what Althusser would call the ruling class, right? And where the ideology comes in is that he also would claim that there is an ideology of the ruling class, right? There's an ideology, which means a belief system, like I have written there, a system of beliefs, like a group of beliefs that are all kind of intertwined and connected in ideology, that supports and justifies having our government the way that it is, having the people who are on top, having the people who are on the bottom stay on the bottom. So ideology can kind of be understood as like a series of beliefs that kind of justify having our social and political order be the way that it is. I know this is kind of confusing, but let's see where it goes. So yes, he would say, Althusser, that there is like a certain belief system that you can associate with the ruling class, and that is where the ideological state apparatuses come in. So he calls them state apparatuses, right? Because these are things that are mostly not really part of the state, like religion, family. These are not things that are controlled by the government directly, at least not usually, right? Not in the society we live in. So he calls these state apparatuses, like things that function on behalf of the state, because he thinks that these are all things, religion, school, family, media, culture, these are all things that he lists as like institutions that are capable of perpetuating the ideology of the ruling class, that these things can kind of embody and disseminate certain beliefs that tend to justify having our society set up the way that it is, having the people, like I said, on top, keeping them in top, the people on the bottom, keeping them on the bottom, right? So how could these things be ideological? What beliefs do they relate to? How can they connect to a belief system that benefits the ruling class? Let's start with like religion, right? So I'm not trying to be like anti-religion or anything, but I think there are certain ways that we can see religion contributing to these kind of ideologies. So I'll say like specifically I'll talk about Christianity because that's just what I know the most about. So Christianity kind of valorizes suffering, right? Like there's a lot of stuff in Christianity about like the afterlife and how if you suffer in this life, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife, right? The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. The meek will inherit the earth. If you're suffering now, God will reward you in the afterlife. So I'm not saying that this is why people came up with this idea or that this is necessarily what it means, but I think there's a way of understanding this conception of suffering and the afterlife and the relation between them as, a ideology, a belief that might make people less willing to like try to overthrow the government or something like that, right? Because if you're suffering right now, but you're going to be rewarded in the afterlife, are you going to be like as motivated to change things in this world, right? It kind of has a way of saying, if you accept the way things are here, you'll be rewarded later. So maybe you don't need to like try to overthrow the government or change the structures of powers, right? And that's not a necessary. It doesn't have to be that way, but I think it can be that way. So like other things that Althusser lists here as ideological state apparatuses, school. I think this one's very obvious, right? How could it be that school like tries to give us beliefs that would help the ruling class or the government? I think a lot of school is about being obedient, right? And I think we can see how obedience would make us not question, the government or the way our society is organized or anything like that. School teaches us obedience and punctuality, and sitting still, and teaches us hierarchy, right? That the teacher is above you and they have authority. It teaches us all these kinds of things, right? You can kind of see how it's set up for you to go from being in a high school classroom to then being like in an office or something like that. Like it's very much the same, sit at your desk, do your work, follow the instructions, all these sorts of things, show up on time. So that's cool. I think family can kind of be similar. I think that families also teach us obedience and authority and things like that. Um, even if it's just like to help us, right? Sometimes kids do need to listen to their parents, but I think we can also see that as teaching people obedience. Media and the news, I think that one's obvious, right? Just in the way that you cover certain news events, how you frame it can make it seem like, the current government's doing good or bad. And then we come to culture, which for our purposes, right? Because again, I am going to circle back to art and analyzing art and stuff, right? And I think culture is where art comes in. So how could this work with art? How is it possible that a piece of art could embody the beliefs of the ruling class, the beliefs that benefit the government, and tell us, everything's fine how it is? Because that really is maybe like the ultimate kind of goal of ideology is to say everything's fine. The way our world is, it's actually fine. It kind of reminds me of that. If you know that the meme of the dog who's like drinking coffee at a table and like his house is on fire in the back, and he has the speech bubble and he says, "This is fine." That's kind of ideology, right? That's what ideology tries to tell you. No matter, regardless of what's happening, actually it's fine. So how can art contribute to this? Here's just one example that I think we can see of this. One example is to look at artistic depictions of like the American dream or like the rags to riches story. We all know this kind of thing where like someone starts out at a low level in society, but they work really hard, right? And they try their best and they hustle and everything else. And through this, they're able to move up in society, right? That's the kind of fundamental thing about the American dream. And I think we can view the American dream as like a piece of ideology that benefits, the ruling class and the government. Because, as long as we believe in the American dream that, you can start off poor and work hard and rise in society, as long as we believe that, then everything's fine, right? Then there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the organization of society and how our government's set up and who it benefits and who it hurts and all that. If you can start poor and become rich and all that, then it's good. As long as, if you work hard, you'll make it. So, for instance, a piece of art that I think embodies this, if you've ever seen the movie Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, and I think also his son, I think his son plays his son in the movie. If you've seen that movie, it's about, at the beginning, Will Smith is like a homeless guy, right? He's got his kid, but he's like going to homeless shelters and stuff. And then he gets a job selling like some kind of medical equipment, like CAT scan machines or something like that. And he has to work really hard, right? He has to make all these deals and be on the phone, and he's running around town and he's taking cabs, and he's hustling as hard as he can to sell these machines. And then by the end of the movie, after all this, he's worked so hard, he makes it, and he whatever, like gets a house or something, or he gets some money or whatever it is. But it's all the whole movie is about him working so hard and it paying off, right? So we can see how a movie like that says the American dream, yes, it's good, yes, it's real, and therefore our society is fine. You just didn't work hard enough, right? So that's how I think a piece of art can justify the ideology of the ruling class, and that is kind of like the crux of Althusser's argument is that art can kind of do the ideological work of maintaining the current system, right? And that's one reason that it would be important to obviously analyze the messages of a piece of art. Now, justifying an ideology and stuff like that, that is not brainwashing, right? This is the important distinction when it came to that Pokemon essay. It's not brainwashing. It's more like propaganda, I think, is maybe the better thing to compare it to. And the important distinction here is that propaganda is sometimes successful, sometimes not. It's not a guaranteed thing. It's not like what's that movie, Clockwork Orange, where the guy has his eyelids taped up and he has to watch the film and it brainwashes him and makes him all different and stuff. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is more like subtle things that could influence you, but maybe not. They're not 100% successful. Like propaganda can be rejected, right? So I think it's better to think of it as maybe kind of unintentional propaganda, because again, I'm not trying to say that there's some kind of big conspiracy and all the artists are just trying to do the business of the government or sell you this stuff. I don't think that's what's happening. I don't think it's necessarily intentional, and I don't think it matters whether or not someone's trying to do this. Um, so that's how I think the piece of art can support the thing. Okay, it can also go the other way though. You might be familiar with the book like Mice and Men, right? Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So that's another book that I think is about the American dream, right? I think there's like a kind of standard reading where like because again, George and Lenny in Mice and Men, they start out poor, right? They're also kind of homeless, right? They're migrant farm workers. They're just kind of going around looking for farm work, and then when they get work, they live on the farm, right? And that's their house now. And they have the dream in the story, right, of owning their own farm and living off the fat of the land. And you know, Lenny is gonna pet the rabbits and all that, right? And throughout that story, they do work hard at times, right? There's also times where they you know, mess up in other ways. But at the end of the story, of course, spoiler alert, you know, for this thing that was written in the 60s or 50s or whatever, you know, George has to shoot Lenny in the head. They never get it, right? So that story is kind of about the American dream not actually being that attainable, or people who don't get the American dream, right? And so I think we could look at that as doing the opposite. If pursuit of happiness justifies the current system and does ideological work on behalf of the government or the ruling class. We could look at something like Mice and Men and say, well, this is doing the opposite. This is telling us the American dream is kind of bullshit, right? And if the American dream is bullshit, then that kind of would draw our whole social order into question, right? That would be like, you know, criticizing the way that things are currently structured, and it would be going against the dominant ideology, going against the ideology of the ruling class. So I think art can do both of these. Art can kind of justify and support the way things are, or art can criticize and question the way that things are. So, and you know, in a way, you could view this as propaganda, you know, for the government and the state and all that, or propaganda against the government and the state and all of that. So it can do both of these things. And again, it's not going to brainwash people. I don't think we need to cancel Pokemon, you know, even though I am somewhat convinced by the argument made there. And the argument in SpongeBob, I'm even more convinced about that. That I kind of land on the side with the strike episode that it sends kind of a bad message, you know. And I think SpongeBob's whole attitude towards work in the entire series is kind of a problem. But even though I think that, I still wouldn't say, well, no one should watch it, or we shouldn't let people watch it, or we should get rid of it. I think that the role of the critic is to make people aware of what messages things send, so that we can kind of have a distance, you know, so that we can not be influenced by it. Because like there are some movies that have bad messages, but they're still good movies and they're still fun and they're still interesting to watch and things like that, you know. So I don't think we need to be like overly moralistic that you can only watch something with a good message. But I think it would also be it'd be good to be aware if the thing has a bad message so that you can try to distance yourself from it and not be influenced by it. You know, if we're looking at it as propaganda, to like recognize it as propaganda, right? Because then it's not going to be as effective. It's not going to influence you. All right. So I guess I've been going on for too long. So I guess I'll stop here and just say that this is why I think that it's important to analyze art, and this is why it should matter. Because the messages, even though they're not going to brainwash people, they still are an instance of ideology. A story can still embody a certain ideology, and it's worth trying to figure out whether it like is a good ideology or a bad ideology, right? All right, I guess that's the best I can do with this. Well, talk to you more soon.